Welcome to another episode of Career Day Detailed. Today we're sitting down with Morgan Yarborough. She is the first funeral director in the world to facilitate natural organic reduction of a human body, essentially human composting. She's been the services manager with Recompose Seattle since 2020, but she's been involved in the afterlife care field since 2016. She's a licensed funeral director in both Washington and Oregon. She's the creator of Our Own Hands, an Oregon-based death care community, and Compassionate Soul. Would you say that your job is it technically considered a mortician or a funeral director, or is there a difference there? Or?
Yeah. So my license is funeral director, right? But I would say mortician for me is a little bit more of an archaic term, and I used that when I did cremations and embalmed and burials. I'm still licensed to do those things, so I like to say mortician. But yeah, here is really more of a funeral directing term at Recompose.
Okay, definitely. I did watch your interview that you did with Spirit Vessel a couple months back.
Cool.
And in that, you kind of talked about how you got started. You said you used to have like funerals for your goldfish, and you also said that it was a bit of a taboo subject in your house, and you would ask your mom questions, and it caused some discomfort for her. Was it also kind of a subject that caused discomfort for you at all, or were you just curious about the topic, or just wanted like the ceremony behind it, or?
I think I was just curious about the topic. The first funeral I remember going to was when I was about 4, and it was for my great grandmother. And he was crying, and I could tell they were sad. I perceived that emotion at a young age, but I didn't know why, and no one offered any explanation. I didn't know what death really meant. And it kind of just stayed that way for most of my childhood. So I was curious and, picking up on whatever was happening, whatever death was, it was bad or scary or negative. And so I did develop a fear of death myself, and I had to deconstruct that as I got older.
Yeah. Do you think that that's something that has been deconstructed? Is that something that you feel like people continually work through, or that you're still working through? And like, how has working in this field impacted that?
Yeah, I even before I started working in death care, I really sat down to try and examine that feeling. And then after joining death care, seeing more of the physical reality of death, started doing more research into like the social aspect of it, the psychological aspect of it, and doing death meditations where I imagined what it might be like to reach the end of my life, to actually be dead, all the things that kind of come along with that. And that was really helpful in bringing up those emotions, bringing up that reactivity that I have to the subject, and just sitting with it and learning how to be friends with it, right? And work through that. And I still have moments of, like mild existential crisis. Like one day I will cease to be alive, and what the hell is that going to be like, right? And I definitely still have moments for that. I think that's true for everybody, and that'll be true up until the day that I die. But I'm able to sit with those emotions and, care for them and care for myself in that way, and kind of reframe things, especially through the lens of the work I do at Recompose, which is, one day my atoms are going to be rearranged and turned back to nature, and I find a lot of comfort in that.
Absolutely. Good answer. In your opinion, do you feel like this industry is equal parts for the person who passes away and for the family of them, or do you feel like it's more for the family to be able to grieve, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, great question. I think that, and this is why I like to talk to the community so much about pre-planning and really thinking about your death, because I think that aspect of it means that it can be for the person who isn't quite dead yet, but is, planning for their death and having that satisfaction of knowing that they have legally arranged what they want, and hopefully, with their family too on the same page. But the ceremony is for the survivors. The ritual aspect is for the survivors. I think that that's just an integral human need that we have in order to integrate what's happening around us in big transitional moments.
Definitely. And in that interview by the Spirit Vessel, you did talk about the ceremonies and how Recompose allows you to do some less traditional things with it. Are you able to tell me about any of those experiences and how that's impacted the families who have been able to go through that with you?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I guess starting for some context about what that ceremony is. When I joined Recompose, my job was to think about what an offering could look like that was Recompose's version of a funeral that involved families and friends as much as they wanted to, that connected them to the Recompose process and really just nature overall. And so I developed what's called the carbon cycle ceremony. And I wanted to, just thinking about the cycles of the planet, that kind of came to mind because it really is part of Recompose's process. The carbon cycle is it sustains life on Earth, right? We're all made up of carbon. So I took different pieces of that, of like what you learn in seventh grade science, right, about those cycles, and came up with light, breath, the plant aspect of it, and earth, soil. And it was designed as originally to be something that can engage clients over Zoom, especially because that's how we started out, is completely having virtual ceremonies due to COVID. So we start with the first element of light, and we all light a candle together, and that invokes the sun, warmth, the light of their person, and it actually has that physical act that people can do of lighting that candle together. And that's really unifying. And from there, we talk about breath or respiration because every living thing does that. Every living thing respirates in some way. And so if people are comfortable, not everybody has to participate. I lead people through some deep breathing together so we can kind of regulate as a group, and breathing intentionally regulates your nervous system, even if you're not with a group of people.
Yeah.
And so that's another level of engagement that, brings us back to nature into that cycle. And in turn, the recomposed vessels are all aerated constantly, right? So it has that even additional layer of connection. So people can learn about that process too while they're breathing. And from there, we talk about plant material. As I'm sure you know, Recompose's process involves using a plant material to facilitate the composting process. We use wood chips, alfalfa, and straw primarily. And now, when people are able to come in for the ceremony, but before, when it was just me doing this, we lay down the straw and the wood chips on top of that person, on the top of the body, right? So they're covered by that. So, talking about how important
We,
plants
as in
are.
the family as well.
Yes, yeah. And now that we have ceremonies in person, they can do that and participate in that. So
Okay.
by acknowledging that plants support us in life, we can then acknowledge how they're supporting us in death, and they can have that tactile moment of interacting with plants while interacting also with their loved one. And so that's really helpful for families. And I found that it was really helpful even through Zoom for them to see that and to have the conversation about how plants are supporting, because plants are everywhere around us. So there's really that connection there with them. And then finally, we talk about earth and about soil because that's where all this is headed, right? The process is becoming soil. And soil supports life. It helps sequester carbon, right? Which is a really important feature of soil. It grows our food, it grows our forests. Without soil, there is no life. And that's kind of the final step in the process that we talk about. That's, the full cycle is you arrive at soil, which then grows new life, and that cycle begins again. And not only is that also an educational piece, but it's also the piece that I hope inspires people and gives them hope, knowing that their person will continue on in the form of new life. And that's really our version of a funeral. And the people who choose to do that have given me feedback that they find almost immediate healing after that ceremony is done because they have that connection to their loved one, to what Recompose's process is, and to the bigger picture, the grand scale of one of the most important cycles on our planet. And so these three pieces I feel really culminate into that true connection. While those pieces are happening, usually in between the last two, their person is actually moved into our threshold vessel, and the door is placed on that vessel. So you have that kind of finality, but also knowing their journey is beginning, right? So it's really a cycle that is designed to connect and to honor and begin a transition.
Are those vessels airtight, or are they open to the...
They're airtight. Yeah, they are sealed. It's a contained environment.
Okay. So there's no smell in there, I assume, with
No,
all the...
no, no. Yeah. No, if you were to, maybe open the door midway through the process, there would be odor there. But we don't do that. So by the time it's time to open them, you have like feedstock smells like alfalfa, right? Like
Okay.
if you have ever been around that, you can kind of get that, that alfalfa scent. But it really, especially once the soil is finished, it smells like the forest floor. It's really pretty cool.
Huh. That totally makes sense.
Hmm. Yeah.
Do you have any stigma in your personal life about this career?
I think that definitely with my family, who still has not figured out that, it's okay to talk about death and to do this work. I would say that there can be some interesting reactions from people when I tell them, not only I'm a funeral director, but tell them about human composting. Because I think the term composting is in there, but also it's so new. There's some initial reaction of like, that makes me uncomfortable. That seems like it could be gross or disrespectful. But then when you actually talk to people about it and sit down and meet them where they're at, you tend to be able to connect with them a little bit more and dispel some of that discomfort or that pushback.
Yeah, definitely. And
Hmm.
kind of along those same lines, one of the things I wanted to bring up is that this was kind of all illegal until 2019 when Washington
Hmm.
became the first state.
Yep.
Since then, we've had Oregon, Colorado, Vermont, and California, but there's still only five. So why do you think
Hmm.
there's such hesitation
Hmm.
and kind of a stigma, I guess, again,
Yeah.
about allowing an alternative option?
Yeah, well, the funeral industry just kind of historically is slow to change. Like cremation took a really long time to be accepted as okay just by the general public, not even talking about religious groups, although a lot of that stigma does come from religious groups, which played a much bigger part in people's lives a century ago than it does now. Those institutions are also slow to change because it's part of people's core beliefs that you should do a certain thing a certain way. And it's also, I think, about community outreach and I even might say marketing. The general public doesn't really know what goes on for things like that. And so when you're having a topic that is already scary to people or they don't know a lot about, and then you introduce all, even more things, I think that creates discomfort. But as far as bigger institutions who make decisions go, I do think that it's connected to kind of our long-standing sense of what is ethical or moral as far as human remains go. It can be really hard to feel like your person or someone who has died is not being treated in a way that you feel is the right way for them. And I think just having conversation kind of helps with that stigma. Just talking about it helps with that stigma. It's really a fear based in, the body being disrespected or tradition that they feel is right being broken. And I can see that point of view. It's just a slow change and more education is needed. And as we can see, even though it's just 5 states, it's 5 states and in a really short period of time.
Oh, definitely, and that's a good way to put it too. It sucks that it's not more openly available, that more people aren't open
Hmm.
to it. It just seems like it makes sense in a way.
Yeah, yeah. And that's when I talk to people about it. Like I was saying, people who may have like an initial gut reaction of that feels weird or like ew. A lot of times, not all the time, and that's okay. It's not going to be for everybody. But when you to educate people and you talk to them just like human to human, sometimes something will click inside of them and they're like, "Oh yeah. Actually, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, of course I would do that. That's the most natural thing in the world, but they just have to kind of think about it for a little bit sometimes."
Yeah, and when the more research I did, the more it totally makes
Hmm.
sense, and even the fact that they did it with cows before and like
Yeah.
livestock have been
Hmm.
composted, it kind of just all clicks together.
Hmm.
But like you said,
Yeah.
even the mention of death makes people uneasy, and it's hard to talk about.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even just telling my some of my friends that I was going to be doing this interview with you kind of created a sense of unease
Yeah.
that it was being
Hmm.
spoken about. It's one of the reasons
Yes.
why I am really glad that we are able to have this conversation, because it's really
Yeah.
good to talk about. And as
Yeah.
soon as I figured out, I actually was scrolling through TikTok one day and saw
Yeah.
something. I'm not entirely sure if it was Recompose or if it was a different. I assume it was Recompose. I'm not sure if there's anywhere else doing it
Yeah.
at this
It
point.
was
But
actually a different company, but yeah, that's all right. There's
oh,
two
okay,
others. Yeah, but yeah.
gotcha.
Hmm.
But anyway, as soon as I saw that, that was what I wanted to do, and then I
Cool.
immediately found Recompose and did a lot more research. And so it's definitely good to be able to talk about it. Hopefully people can watch this and learn more about it and
Yeah.
explore it as an
Hmm.
option for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I believe so strongly in community outreach. I really feel, holding things like death cafes or public events where people can just come and talk about death and learn more, especially from an industry professional, it can help with the fear and it can help get those conversations started. And I really think, at least from my own experience, that when you do that and you kind of start to process and come to terms with we're all mortal, so what would you like to do with that? And it's really hard. It's hard to have a healthy relationship with that, especially when society doesn't like to talk about it. But I think it improves your quality of life once you can start doing that.
Yeah, I have to agree. I know the original plan was for it to be kind of a collective core tower, for
Yeah.
lack of better. But for my
Hmm.
understanding, to ease the weight of legality,
Hmm.
it got changed to individual vessels. Do you think that's
Yeah.
ultimately the best way to go, especially with the collaboration with Bell's Mountain Forest that you guys have?
Hmm.
Or do you think that maybe in the future that original idea could come back?
I do actually think it was the best way to go. I think that the idea of, like a collective core is a really cool idea. But just from having industry knowledge from a practical standpoint, I feel like it something that was functional of a collective. To me, it still is because if you look at the pictures of our facility and our vessel online, those vessels are part of what we call an array. And so it's like to me, it almost looks like honeycomb, like a hive. And so all these people are here undergoing this incredible transformation into, to rearranging their molecules in individual vessels, yes, but they're still people are still like by each other in an array together. And I really like that concept. And I also think that even though recompose kind of our ethos at the end of the process, especially with Bell's Mountain, is that the ethos, but there is still a very human need to know that your individual human person that you love, like to know where they are and to know what's happening with their remains. So I think that's kind of the healing process. It gives people more time to process the death and to know that specifically their loved one is being cared for at Recompose. And then kind of at the end of the journey, they are taken and the soil, people's soil is put in a large truck together. So there's commingling that people sign off on. Our clients have to sign a form for that, but their loved one is then like that's their new journey. That's them being set free, they're now becoming the forest. And so I do see a benefit to that system instead of the collective core, which I think would be a much faster switch from my individual human died to where's that individuality now? I think it's a gentler transition.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. In cremation, there's essentially like a controlled grease fire going on
Hmm.
from
Hmm.
body fat. Does
Hmm.
uh, weight cause any issues in human cremation? Is there or human composting? I apologize.
Hmm.
Or is there like a max weight of the vessels, or how does
Yeah,
that?
there is. So we have different sizes of vessels to accommodate different body types, but there is just because of the design, there is a max weight, but it's still pretty high. It's like around, I think, 4 to 500 pounds. So, trying to be as inclusive for folks as possible. But what's really interesting about the process is that the plant materials, that combination is catered to the unique body type of that person. Like
Oh
if
wow.
there's some really tall, totally like beefcake person coming in, right? Like they got a lot of muscle, that affects the recipe that we use. That affects the feedstocks that are used and how we apply those. And I find that fascinating. It's very, very
Yeah, that's
catered to
really
the
interesting.
individual. Yeah, it's super cool. So you have to pay attention to things like that, and you have to change your feedstocks and your plant materials to fit that. But it's definitely doable, and I like that. I think it's even more unique to the person.
That makes sense. Are you still able to, especially with COVID over now, have like a traditional viewing when the person first goes into the vessel? Are people still able to come and be with the body until then?
Yeah, yeah. Now that we have our Seattle facility open, we did not have that ability when we were in our first smaller facility in Kent. But now that we have the Seattle location open, we have two different options for that. If they want to maybe just like see their person's face, but have the rest of them shrouded, we can do that in our main ceremony room, in our gathering space. They can have time to have that viewing before the ceremony begins. If they want a little bit more time or they want to be more hands-on, maybe they want to like brush mom's hair or do ritual bathing if they have a religious need for it. We have what's called the cedar room, and that was really inspired by community death care and home funerals. And so all the things that you might find for home funerals are in that room. So, you know, cotton, ways to close the mouth of your person without having to do the really invasive suturing that funeral homes do. There's essential oils, there's things to like sponge bath your person too. There's just a lot of different tools in there for people to have that hands-on time if they want to lead the death care a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And then is the person fully clothed when they're composting? Or
No, they're actually so I always like to kind of say, the way you came into this world is the way that you go out and with Recompose. And that's just because the composting process is so sensitive that we can't really put any kind of, especially like synthetic, particularly fabrics in there. So while you're shrouded for your ceremony, once that you are in that vessel, that shroud is removed by our funeral directors.
oh, okay. So
Hmm.
typically you would just be shrouded for that viewing. It wouldn't be
Yeah.
clothed and then unclothed
Yeah.
before. Okay, that makes
Yeah,
complete
yeah,
sense.
and if we had a special request, we would accommodate that, of course, but it is typically, at least for the main ceremony, that person is shrouded.
Okay. Do you have to work non-traditional hours? Is it similar to some other funeral homes where if somebody passes in the middle of the night, you may get a call
Hmm.
and have to go out there in the middle of the night?
Well, we do get the call. Someone's monitoring Recompose phones 24/7. Our funeral directors all take shifts for that, but we don't have to go out and get the person. We actually contract with a really, really lovely local business who that's just what they do for local funeral homes.
Because there's not embalming involved, would you have a little bit more time, like you wouldn't have to come in till the morning, or would it still be the same
Mhm.
thing where you kind of go in right away and start doing what you got to do?
Fortunately, no. What the transport team will do is they have the code to enter our facility. So they'll bring the person to our facility and they'll put them in our cold area. We have a refrigeration unit, like a lot of funeral homes do. So that person will be kind of checked in to recompose and be in refrigeration until the time of their ceremony.
Okay. During the process, the heat can get up to like 160 degrees Fahrenheit,
Hmm.
and that can take care of any pathogens or anything that's in the body.
Hmm. Hmm.
What happens before that process gets up to that temperature? Is there any health
Hmm.
risks associated for you? Or I'm sure you got PPE that you are using at
Yeah.
times and stuff, but
Oh, definitely. Yeah, just like a conventional funeral home, our funeral directors all wear the proper protective equipment that not only keeps you safe, but it's required by law. So gloves, gowns, the whole deal. And we also use disinfectant sprays too, like a mortuary would. We don't embalm and we don't have embalming chemicals, but we still need to take those same precautions to keep ourselves safe. So we wear that PPE right up until the person is in their vessel, the door is sealed, and then we roll everything back and we clean everything and then we'll take off our protective equipment.
and from my research, it takes about 30 days for that composting process to fully happen.
Yeah, again, it's really depends on the individual person, which we really saw a lot more with the last year and a half of doing this work. It can be, I would say, maybe 30 to even 45 days inside of the vessel, just depending on the person. And then after the time in vessel is done, the soil's taken out and put into what we call a curing bin, and that's where it cools off. The moisture levels kind of regulate, and we send in our samples to the state soil lab for testing, which is also a legal requirement, and that usually takes a week or two. So a little bit longer than 30 days, but it just depends.
Is there a way for you guys to see inside, or is that, like you were saying, you open the door early and have to
Yeah,
check and
not ideal. We would try really hard to avoid that. The door, you can open the door, but essentially what you see at that point is, mostly just the feedstocks because the person is cocooned into those plant materials. Um, and that's by design. There's a lot more of the plant materials than there is with the person. You end up with a whole cubic yard of soil at least, which fills a whole truck bed, right? So you're seeing a lot of plant materials in there. But yeah, we would want to be really careful. And unless some sort of terrible emergency happened, we would keep that door on.
uh, I guess I'm just asking, like, how do you know if the
Hmm.
person, if it takes
Hmm.
longer, or do you typically just wait
Mm.
like 45 days or so just to be safe?
Yeah, the temperatures tell us that. So the
Oh,
temperatures are
okay.
coming from that microbial activity, and they produce the heat as they're breaking down the person, right? That's what those microbes' job is, and it just generates warmth. So when we see those temperatures drop, we know that that microbial activity has slowed down, which means that there's nothing for them to break down anymore.
Oh, okay. Definitely.
Mhm.
That makes perfect sense. Thanks for explaining that. I was a little
Yeah, of
confused there.
course. Yeah, no, totally.
Do you guys handle bodies that have been autopsied or that have been in accidents? And do you do
Mhm.
anything different if the person's less
Mhm.
presentable or?
Yeah, we have all sorts of people come to us from all sorts of causes of death. Autopsies are pretty common. And if a family is requesting, a viewing or interaction with their person in the case of autopsy or severe trauma, we don't do restoration. So we can accommodate things like maybe doing like a hand holding where the person's body is covered, but they can come hold their loved one's hand. Or in some cases, depending on the situation, we're able to cover the person's body and maybe just have their face exposed. And those are some things that we can accommodate. But as far as the process of getting the person in the vessel for an autopsy person, we just have to be a lot more careful because there's a lot more exposure risk there for our staff. So being even more careful, making sure that we remove any like plastics or things that we know won't break down during the process. So we're just really careful about that. But it's really the same way the person goes in the vessel in the same manner.
Okay.
Mhm.
Is that something you did when you were working at traditional funeral homes?
Yeah, when I was working at traditional funeral homes, because I was an embalming intern and then a licensed embalmer, I performed autopsy restoration and restorative art, restorative art is the purpose of it is to get that person more like their form and color that they were when they were living.
And is that something that took a lot of training, a lot of skill, like practice
Yeah.
to get, or?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. Mortuary school is pretty intensive, as it should be. I mean, you have to learn everything from like color theory to working with waxes and sculpting features to pathology, anatomy, different types of suturing. There's a lot that you learn, including all the laws and regulations. So mortuary school is intensive for a reason. And then when you're apprenticing, you can learn all that stuff in school, but you really don't put it into practice until you're actually doing the work. And there's so many different skills and tricks to learn when you're doing that I could I could probably do it for my whole life and still be learning stuff all the time. So, yeah, it's a combination of science and art, and it takes a lot of skill.
Definitely. Do you have any advice for somebody who wants to get into this field or this industry?
Mm. Yeah, I do. And I actually talk to a lot of people who are interested in it. My advice is to look at your state requirements, what you need to be a funeral director or an embalmer. Sometimes those are separate licenses. So look at your state's requirements, look at mortuary school requirements and costs. And I also advise before you apply and start mortuary school, see if you can work at a funeral home as a funeral assistant, somebody who actually goes and gets the person. Those are called removal technicians typically, even doing clerical work, like put yourself in that environment and see how it feels to you to be in that world before you dive in. Because not only are there long hours, it's physical work, but it's a lot of emotional work and it's mentally taxing too. So make sure that that's an environment that you feel like you can operate in long term and keep yourself safe and take care of yourself in.
Yeah, great answer. And then I just got one last question for you that
Hmm.
I like to ask everybody who I talk to. It's not necessarily about your career, but
Sure.
I had a nonprofit organization that helped kids who got bullied.
Hmm.
And so I like to ask everybody, have you ever been bullied? And do you have any advice for kids who may be going through that?
That is such an interesting question. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, yeah, I was as a kid growing up in rural southern Arizona, which is a really conservative place. I was into, alternative things. I was a goth kid. I still am a goth kid in my heart. Um, that wasn't really accepted very well. And so you get bullying not only from your peers, but also from adults in your life, right? And especially as a fat woman, growing up same way, like there's not a lot of fat acceptance in the world, right? Still. And so feeling bullied for that too. And I'm just a bigger statured person. I'm tall. Yeah, that's just how I am. And it can be hard to be different in those ways in a world that doesn't accept them. And it took a long time for me to learn to love myself. And I like to tell people that it's valid for you to feel the feelings of not being comfortable with yourself. Everybody goes through that. It's not okay for people to bully you for that or for people to be mean. It's not an excuse, but it's a reason, I think, for me to have come around and to view the adults in my life who bullied me as people who don't understand, who are willingly ignorant, and who live their lives and have those reactions based in fear that they don't address. And so when you understand the
Right.
psychology behind that, unfortunately, kids, it's hard to do that as a kid. You gain a little bit more perspective and you realize that if somebody is bullying you and being mean to you, whatever the case may be, it's because they have a problem with themselves. And that's what it comes down to. And that doesn't make it any easier to experience bullying, right? But know that it's not you. You are beautiful and perfect the way that you are. And it is them who has the problem that they're not working through. And find community, find friends, find people who you can build that bond with. There's power in community. And that can still be hard to do, but that's what saved me, having my little group of friends that I could vent to and take shelter with emotionally, take refuge in them is helpful. You're not alone. There are people like you all over the place. You just got to find them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's one of the best answers I've gotten so far. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you again for asking. That's such a good question.
Yeah, it's really important to me to show that like everybody deals with that and you get through it and you find a good career that you love,
Hmm.
and I think that
Yeah.
that's important for people to see too. I am curious if I can ask
Yeah.
real quick. You
Yeah.
said that you're
Yeah.
from Arizona. How did you end up
Hmm.
going to a
Yeah.
state? I figured you were from Washington or Oregon. How did you end up going to a place that
Yeah.
offers the human composting?
Yeah, it is such a winding story. Like I said, growing up where I grew up, I didn't really fit in, but my grandparents on my mother's side are from Washington, and they were my confidants and people who I felt accepted me when I was growing up. And my grandfather would always tell me how much I would love Washington, how the university in Seattle is a place for more, people like me to talk about the things I like to talk about and to learn more about the world. So I always kind of carried that thought in my head, and then I actually ended up dating a person whose parents lived in Eugene, Oregon. And I
Okay.
went to visit and I was like, wow, I love it here. This is so different. So I lived in Oregon for a while, quickly realized the world was much bigger and stopped dating that person. So that's how that went. But and that's where I started my funeral director internship. I was working in tech before. I was not happy. And I was like, I've always been interested in this field. Let's just dive in. And I did. And I fell in love with it. I became very passionate about green burials, different options, home funerals. I really just kind of felt that like the people who are experiencing that death should be able to care for their person how they want. So that's kind of what led me to Recompose. I learned about it in 2018. I was like, I want to be a part of that one day. And in 2020, it happened.
Awesome. Well, once again, thanks for your time. I'm
Mhm.
glad that that person, even though it didn't work out, I don't know if you believe that
Yeah.
everything happens for a reason, but it brought
Hmm.
you here, and you're doing
Yes.
some great things for
Thank
the
you.
afterlife community, if you will. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate everything that you're doing, even beyond here. Did you want to direct anybody on where to find you or anything? Or
Yeah, people can always reach me through email. It's Morgan at ourownhands.us. If you want to learn more about Recompose, you can go to recompose.life, Life. Reach out to our team or to me. We're a small crew, so you can get in touch with me there too. But if anyone has questions about the industry, what Recompose is doing, anything else, please reach out. I love interacting with the community.
awesome. Well, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and keep up the good work.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks. You too. Bye bye.
Bye.